So I've been exploring horror games of the PS1 library recently for reasons, and I found myself in a nice little pocket of dark and dank anime horror games. Now today's little list isn't trying to encompass every single example, but instead we'll delve a little deeper into a triple pack of terror with 3 titles based on some classic horror manga and anime franchises. First up, we've got one based on Vampire Hunter D, a prolific and influential series that began in 1983, created by Hideyuki Kikuchi. Also here we have illustrations by legendary artist Yoshitaka Amano, who would go on to making art for the Final Fantasy games a few years later. Vampire Hunter D now has over 56 books released to date, and 2 feature-length animated films. The 1985 movie was actually my introduction to Japanese animation when I was a kid, and I quickly became obsessed with watching whatever random anime VHS tapes I could get my hands on in the years to follow. Oddly enough, Vampire Hunter D would only see one single video game adaptation, released for the PlayStation 1 in late 1999 in Japan, and also in Europe and North America the following year, around the same time that the second animated film Vampire Hunter D Bloodlust would be released. While Jalico published the North American release, the actual development and publishing in other regions was handled by Victor Interactive Software, a division of Victor Entertainment, which was a subsidiary of JVC, basically a big multimedia publishing and electronics company. I wouldn't blame you for expecting this game to be a lazy cash grab at this point, with the copious amount of games Victor would be releasing around this time with a wide range of quality, and this is by no means a great game by standard measurements, but getting past the critical panning it received and other low expectations I had before going into this, I ended up having a pretty awesome time with this one. In case you're not familiar with Vampire Hunter D, the premise basically follows the adventures of D, a half-human, half-vampire roaming around a post-apocalyptic world inhabited by a mix of humans, mutants, demons, and vampires, of course. D is an extremely powerful vampire hunter with supernatural abilities, a really long sword, a cybernetic horse, and a symbiotic and sentient left hand that often provides comic relief or has plenty of powerful abilities of his own.
Ah, yummy. Feed me more.
This particular game's premise is loosely based on the 3rd novel, which would also be the basis of the Bloodlust film previously mentioned, although there are substantial differences in the sequence of events between the two. In the game, Dee is hired by a man to rescue his daughter Charlotte, who was presumably kidnapped by a vampire named Meyer Link, but in reality they run off together seeking refuge in the castle of Countess Carmilla, and the majority of the game takes place in this castle in pursuit of Charlotte, where you also encounter another team of vampire hunters hired for the same gig. Getting into the gameplay, from looking at the footage here, you're probably thinking this is basically a Resident Evil knockoff, and you wouldn't be wrong. It's got clunky tank controls, fixed camera angles as you explore the various rooms of the castle, and some light puzzle solving as you track down items or keys needed to open up new areas. This does at least have a few other things setting it apart though. D can switch between having his sword sheathed or at the ready, depending on whether you're fighting off the strange creatures of the castle or just investigating your surroundings and picking things up. He can also block, dodge, and jump, which is necessary for some occasional moments of basic and mildly frustrating platforming sections. And as often seen in 3D games of this era, the camera can be as difficult of a foe as the actual enemies themselves. D's left hand, which also has its own energy bar, gives you some special abilities, like some projectile attacks, healing yourself, or inhaling the souls of weakened enemies to refill your left hand energy gauge. And if you have enough left hand energy remaining when you run out of life points, you can also get revived instantly. I should also mention D has 2 gauges himself, one for life points and one for vampire points, and higher VP will correlate with executing more powerful attack abilities. It's a little confusing at first, but eventually you'll learn how to best keep things in balance, and there are plenty of consumable items to help with this as well. Other useful items include some sub-weapons like darts, hand grenades, and flash bombs, which was an item I found to be crucial for dealing with these snake ladies slithering around. You can also find maps for different areas of this quite expensive castle, and of course the various keys and things needed to keep making progress. Another interesting thing that helps keep things from being stale are multiple endings depending on certain things that occurred during your playthrough, alternate cutscenes at certain spots, and even a section of the game where you control Leela, another vampire hunter armed with a handgun. She was a lot of fun to play as, and I was honestly hoping for a little more playtime with that character, because running and gunning around with her was a nice mid-game mix-up. There are also a handful of boss fights throughout, which I found to be on the easy-to-exploit side, but I should probably come clean and admit to playing this on easy mode for my first playthrough, so it's safe to assume normal and hard modes will be considerably less forgiving, especially since you get fewer items and you take more damage in those higher difficulty levels, which are pretty nice to have in case you want to try multiple playthroughs of this. The game itself isn't terribly long, especially once you know where to be heading next, but even on my first playthrough I only got kinda stuck briefly a couple of times. And your left hand comes in handy here, as he will suggest not wasting your time by going through certain doors. Overall, I ended up really digging this game, and was glad I gave it a try despite it being critically panned in the past. The aesthetic is just really cool if you like dark, low-poly horror kind of stuff. The environments are really nice and supported with some atmospheric sound design and mellow synth music. The voice acting was also really solid, even with some of the Bloodlust anime voice cast coming over to help with the game adaptation.
City of the Night. I thought that place was nothing more than ruins, that no one lived there.
That may be. The City of the Night is our last hope for our peaceful home at last.
And while the gameplay is certainly a bit derivative and a bit janky if you stack this up against more polished survival horror on the PS1, there aren't any major flaws or issues either, so I'd recommend giving this one a shot, especially if you have interest in the series at large. And next up, another massively monumental horror manga and anime series would get the tank-controlled survival horror treatment, kinda, with Devilman, released only in Japan in 2000 for the PS1 and Windows 98. I say kinda because this feels a little bit like two games packed into one here. It's honestly not far removed from the duality of Devilman and high school student Akira Fudo, the protagonist of this series and this game, who puts on a weird mask and absorbs the demonic powers of Amon, and battles against various other demons in contemporary times. Now, Devilman began in the early 70s as an animated series and manga created by Go Nagai, a highly influential creator also known for his work on Cutie Honey and Mazinger Z. And Devilman saw lots of success as an ultraviolet take on the typical superhero formula, and would go on to spawn numerous additional OVAs and series, and most recently, Devilman Crybaby. And much like Vampire Hunter D, despite the popularity and legacy of Devilman, there aren't really a lot of video games based on this. There was at least a Famicom game, a somewhat primitive action-adventure title, which does have an English fan translation at least, but otherwise I could only track down a random Devilman Mahjong and typing tutor game for Japanese computers. Or if you really want to stretch, he does make an appearance in CB Chara Wars, a weird Super Famicom beat-em-up loaded with various Go Nagai created characters. But getting back to the PS1 game, it starts off with you in control of Akira, the previously mentioned high school kid, and you meet up with your friend Ryo to investigate the paranormal secrets that his father was uncovering before his demise. There are fully voiced cutscenes here, all in Japanese with no English translation available, unfortunately, so you might want to brush up on the OVAs or something first to get a general idea of the characters and some of the storyline concepts presented here.
あらゆる物体、生物と合体できるデーモンがなぜ人間とだけ合体しにくいか。
Now, it's not long before Akira fuses with the demon Amon, and other demons begin to attack this duo, but the first section of the game has you completely defenseless against these monsters. And in pure survival horror fashion, you must explore the mansion and find safety. Understandably, you may be foaming at the mouth just to violently dismember your foes, as Devilman is usually known to do, but this chapter of the game actually ends up being quite tense and effectively anxiety-inducing. So in some ways, it's a bit of a slow burn to start out, but by the end of this little story arc, your true Devilman adventure begins. So chapter 2 is definitely more action-centric, as you no longer need to run away from demons and instead just eviscerate them, whether you are in the swole Akira Fudo state or all-out Amon mode. It's still got tank controls, so it does feel like a clunky beat-em-up at this point, with a handful of basic kicking and punching combos and some highly damaging finishers that almost give this an early aughts wrestling game kind of feel. You have a couple of other powers as well, like a finicky mind control laser or an area of effect blast. On top of the combat, there are some moments where you'll have the chance to rescue some human hostages within a certain amount of time. It's not ultimately required, but I should mention that you do get a graded score at the end of each chapter, which comes into play later. Chapter 2 is also loaded with a handful of boss fights, with some familiar demons you might recognize if you know the series. They mix up the admittedly repetitive fights with all the generic monsters quite nicely, with some bits of dialogue and sometimes more strategic approaches to defeating them. Now, this game is a bit on the short side, with 3 chapters in total, and unfortunately, Chapter 3 is not accessible unless you can get an A rank on Chapters 1 and 2, which basically amounts to minimal saving, using items, dying, freeing all the hostages, and generally killing everything as quickly as you can. Chapter 3 is a pretty epic looking boss fight with Siren, which I could say I won't show because I don't want to spoil anything, but honestly, I couldn't unlock it yet. On the positive side, if you can at least beat these 2 chapters with C rank, you unlock TV Devilman, which gives Akira and Devilman a retro look based on the 70s design, and they even have slightly different movesets. It's easily worth it for this new intro too. But again, this game is probably a breezy 2 or 3 hour playthrough if you're not willing to put in the extra skill-heavy work to get to the final stage and see the true ending. Now, I probably can't give this as strong of a recommendation as Vampire Hunter D, since it's really much simpler and more shallow of an experience. It still has some things about it I really liked. The different gameplay approaches of each chapter were pretty interesting, and the visuals were also really well done, notably not utilizing pre-rendered backgrounds and fixed camera, and instead using a dynamic camera with effective, grimy, and creepy 3D environments. And it's too bad there isn't a translation of this one for the cutscenes, but at least it's still definitely playable without any Japanese knowledge. But again, I think if you watch the old OVAs, I think you'll get a general idea of what's going on. And if anything, this got me thinking I should explore the Famicom game one of these days. And the last game we'll be checking out today is a quite late release in the PS1's life cycle, coming out in 2003, and honestly one of the bigger surprises of the year for me. This is GeGeGe no Kitaro Gyakushu Yoma Daikesen, a Konami-developed 2D run-and-gun game with gorgeous pixel art graphics. So this was part of a trio of games celebrating the 80th birthday of the series creator Shigeru Mizuki, our third legendary manga master today, one well known for reviving interest in supernatural yokai and monsters from Japanese folklore. GeGeGe no Kitaro was his most popular work, beginning in 1960, and going on to see numerous animated series, live-action movies, and a substantial amount of video game adaptations, all the way from the Famicom to the Nintendo DS. The premise of the series revolves around Kitaro, a well-intended yokai kid and last survivor of the Ghost Tribe, who gets into all sorts of wacky adventures as he seeks to unite the world of humans and yokai. In case you're wondering about his emo haircut, he's missing an eye, but luckily his knowledgeable and loving dad follows him around in an anthropomorphized eyeball form to help him out. But getting into the premise of the game, once again, I wish I could give more details, but this is another Japanese exclusive title that hasn't seen a fan translation yet. But once you figure out the menus, this is still very playable regardless. But the basic thing here, you receive letters as you progress through the game, tasking you with battling against different yokai in your vicinity, with different areas accessible through this world map hub, and sometimes you may even need to traverse previously explored areas again to reach more distant ones newly revealed to you. The gameplay and controls are pretty typical of a classic action platformer or run and gun game, probably best described here as a mashup of Ghosts and Goblins and Contra. Kitaro's main attack is shooting hair needles in multiple directions, but also has a handful of different special attacks executed by holding the button down and charging up your shot and releasing with different button combinations. He's got a spread shot, a temporary shield, and my personal favorite, remote-controlled get-a-sandal attack. You can also summon a helper for a short while, which can be selected from your home base on the world map. It's a fun crew of his friends from the series, each with their own unique abilities. Now, if you've ever wanted to fart on Frankenstein or Dracula, now's your chance. All in all, you have a healthy assortment of ways to blast your enemies and make your way through numerous levels. Having to repeat some of the shorter stages was a little weird, and at this point I should say you only have one life and no checkpoints for each mission. You can only restore a little bit of health after completing one of these mini stages, so the challenge level can get a little spicy. But those most repeated stages are at least a bit shorter in comparison. Regardless of that, the levels are all really cool, with extremely well-crafted environments full of fun little surprises, and a variety of awesome-looking monsters in your path, and some really creative boss fights. If you have any interest in yokai or cool monsters in general, you'll really have a field day with the design and pixel art here. It was really a ton of fun to push forward and see what weird creatures I'd have to face off with next. There are 3 difficulty settings, but even normal knocked me on my ass pretty often, especially in the daunting final stage featuring the foreign yokai takeover attempt with numerous mini-bosses and a really insane final boss. In the end, despite that absolutely brutal final level, which took me several hours to finally see victory, I absolutely love this game, and I'm surprised I don't see more people talking about this one. I guess it's a quite rare game to find a physical copy of, and the only GeGeGe no Kitaro game that has been officially localized was the first one, reskinned as Ninja Kid for the NES. But still, this game is too good, so if you can get your hands on this one, definitely give it a try. Kitaro would see a couple of other PS1 appearances if you're curious, and not facing language barriers, like a 3D first-person adventure game, or even a pachinko game. And of course, plenty of other GeGeGe no Kitaro would appear on other consoles in a wide variety of genres. And tangentially, there's also a really weird 1v1 fighting game featuring all sorts of Shigeru Mizuki-designed yokai creations. Something for the real sickos to go into the deep end of PS1 oddities. And there are a few other instances of anime horror on the PS1 out there, like if you stretch into supernatural territories like 3x3 Eyes or Shaman King, but we'll save those for that big PS1 project I teased earlier. And feel free to drop some recommendations in the comments if you've got any. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll catch you next time.